Okay, let's talk about multiplication. Multiplication is another operation that we can perform. Much like the property of addition or properties of addition, multiplication is also commutative, it's associative, it's got an identity. There's a couple other new properties down here that apply only to multiplication. And we'll also talk in a second about the inverse property. But let's talk about those properties and then we'll talk about some of the intricacies, some of the small things to do with multiplication. Multiplication can be commutative. Commutativity, remember from addition, is just saying we can switch the order of numbers. So 3 times 4 is the same thing as 4 times 3. We can switch the order of the two numbers being multiplied and it won't change the product, right? It won't change the final answer. The associative property, again, we can also group it in different ways. 3 times 4, then times 8. Well, that would have been a 12, right? 3 times 4. Then multiplied by 8 would have given us 96. Well, what if instead, notice we moved the parentheses. What if we did the 4 times 8 first? Note the example here, right, in that associative property. What if we did 4 times 8 first? Well, 32 times 3 is still 96. So again, we can move the parentheses. As long as it's all multiplication, we can multiply in any order we want. We'll still get the same answer, right? So that associative property, we can multiply whichever of the three numbers we want first, and then finish by doing that last number. The identity property, now this one's a little bit different than addition. Remember that in addition, the identity property was to say if you add 0, a number won't change, right? Well, when it comes to multiplication, if you multiply by 1, 1 is what we call the multiplicative identity. Remember again, 0 is the additive identity, 1 is the multiplicative identity. If you multiply by 1, nothing changes, right? 7 times 1 would be 7. So again, we call that the identity property. The number didn't change. It kept its identity. We also have a couple of new properties. These didn't really apply to addition. The property of 0. Well, if we multiply by 1 and nothing changes, remember that if you multiply by 0, you'll always get 0. So that's a pretty easy one. If you multiply by 0, you get 0. That's the property of 0, or the multiplication property of 0. The property of -1, along those same lines. Well, if you multiply something by -1, you'll always get its opposite, right? 9 times -1 is -9. -9 times -1 would have been +9. You're always going to change the sign, right, by multiplying by -1. So those are two very helpful properties. They'll come in handy later on in algebra. Let's talk about the inverse property. Again, for addition, it meant if you add something that's to its opposite, we always got back 0. We got the additive identity back. Well, when you're multiplying, if we're going to do an inverse, we want to get the additive identity back, or sorry, the multiplicative identity back. If we want to multiply inversely, we want to cancel it away. We want to essentially get 1 as an answer. And if we multiply by the reciprocal of a number, okay, the reciprocal, such as 9 and 1/9, right? We flip the number over. 9 is normally over 1, right? Any whole number can be a fraction, but 9 would have a 1/9. If we flip that over, right, we switch the numerator with the denominator, we would get 1/9. And if we take 9 times 1/9, we get 1. Such as if we take -3 times -1/3. Notice all I did was the reciprocal. I didn't change the sign at all. They're both negative. If I took a -3 though, right, times a -1/3, it's reciprocal. +3 on the top, +3 on the bottom, right? The two negatives will cancel. We'll talk more about that. We'd end up with 1 for an answer. The inverse property of multiplication is if you multiply a number by its reciprocal, you get back 1. All right, so enough of the properties. Let's talk a little bit about actual multiplication. And one of the biggest things in multiplying we have to worry about, as we just saw a minute ago, is multiplying by negative numbers. 10 times -5 is going to be a -50. Essentially, we can multiply the two numbers, and we just want to keep track of how many negative numbers there were. A negative number times a positive number, or a positive times a negative, either way, is going to give a negative answer. So if you have an odd number of negatives, that's an easy way to think of it, an odd number of negatives, we're going to end up with a negative answer. So of the two other examples over here at the right, notice down here at the bottom, I've got a -4/5, essentially a -3/2 here. It doesn't matter if the negative's on the top or the bottom, or if it's out in front, like it is on this -5/8. We have 3 negatives. Well, 2 negatives, as we say down here at the bottom, 2 negatives makes a positive. So 2 of those negatives could essentially cancel each other away, but because there's 1 more left, we're going to get a negative answer. Then we just have to remember to multiply fractions. We're going to multiply the top. So 4 times 3 would have been 12, right? And 12 times 5 is 60, so we've got negative 60 over, then I'm going to multiply with the numbers in the denominator, numbers on the bottom. 5 times 2 times 8, so 5 times 2 is 10, times 8 would be 80. And hey, 60 over 80, I think 20 goes into both of those. And I believe that would very simply, if we reduced it down, be a negative 3/4. We can reduce our fractions. Now the example in the middle, notice we have two negatives going on. So again, that's going to come out to a positive number, right? We can cancel those two negatives. Negative times negative, again, makes a positive. Just like positive times positive would be positive. And now all we have to do is multiply the numbers. So tell you what, let's do a little bit of associative property here. Why don't I do the first two numbers, and I'll do the second two numbers, and then we'll put them together. 2 times 3 would have been 6. Multiplied by 5 times 10 would have been a 50. And grand total, 6 times 50, would be 300. Positive 300 though, because those negatives canceled away. Don't forget to watch out for negatives when you're doing some multiplication. If you have any questions about the properties or the negative properties of multiplying, or the commutative, associative, identity, and inverse, right? Or that property of 0 or property negative 1. If you have any questions on multiplication, ask your teacher. Otherwise, good luck and have a great day.